Let's talk about justice and injustice, because, of course, we all remember just recently happened the terrible shooting of Stephon Clark in Sacramento. Of course, you're not the you're not in charge of the Sacramento County Sheriff. We understand that, of course. But what do you think about the way that police forces across the state of California interact with their citizenry? Here in Butte County, in Chico, we're beginning to see now social workers beginning to be embedded with police officers to try to address some of these situations that may come up with people that perhaps, in many cases, are mentally ill. And the police will engage with them without the training to perhaps de-escalate those situations without violence. So, I guess my question really is that perhaps a good idea to be adopted statewide? And what are some other ways we can help to kind of de-escalate these terrible situations where people get shot for holding a cell phone?
I think it's a very good idea. I think, unfortunately, the police have been asked to be mental health counselors and mental health treatment providers, which they're ill-equipped to do. That's not their training. That's not their professional experience. And so ideas like you've described in Butte County, where social workers or mental health treatment and counselors are deployed to situations that are occurring involving mentally ill people, or accompanying police as they go about their business, I think makes a lot of sense. I mean, we shouldn't be asking the police to do that job. And sadly, we're seeing a rise in the incidence of homelessness and a rise in the proportion of the homeless who are mentally ill. And so as a consequence, there's a need to change, I think, how we go about helping them. And one way is not just throwing them into jail, but rather providing them with services they need and having the appropriate professionals provide those services. I think we've got to look beyond that, though, to overall our policing policies and police training. And it's very difficult. There's no question. To be a law enforcement officer is a challenging job. You're putting yourself at risk day in, day out. At the same time, the Stephon Clark shooting and all the other examples of shootings, whether it's a person of color or a person of color who happens to be mentally ill or any variation thereof, demonstrate that we've got a real problem on our hands. And I think one thing to look to is changing police policy and police practices and training so that the focus is on de-escalation and avoiding escalating a situation to where you end up with gun violence. And so I think there's a lot to be done in that area. I also think that all of us approach our daily lives with backgrounds, experiences, culture, history that informs how we interact with each other. And despite our best efforts to make sure we're not engaging in or interacting in a way that manifests bias, it can creep in. And so there are these implicit biases, unfortunately, that creep into all of our interactions with one another. And I think it's really important to be mindful of that and to address that. So as a leader of a statewide law enforcement agency myself, the head of the Department of Insurance, where I have law enforcement officers, the year before last, I initiated unconscious bias training for our law enforcement personnel. Nobody told me I had to do it. There's no law that directed me to do it. I just thought it was the right thing to do. And in fact, we extended that to all of our employees. And so the purpose of that training was to get our law enforcement personnel, as well as all of our personnel, thinking about the ways in which unconscious bias might creep into their interactions with other people, whether it's the public or coworkers or anybody else for that matter, and to think about ways in which to try to mitigate against that. And I think that's particularly important for law enforcement personnel as well. So I think we've got a lot of work to do here. I think as Attorney General, what I would do is push really hard for changes in policing policy, changes in training, implicit bias training, but also use the Office of Attorney General to hold accountable those that are engaged in civil rights violations. I think it's noteworthy that in the entire history of the Office of Attorney General, going back decades, there have been only 3 civil rights investigations of law enforcement agencies ever initiated. 2 were initiated in Kamala Harris's tenure, and one was initiated in the tenure of Jerry Brown. And so being willing to, where the evidence and law supports it, to hold accountable those that are violating civil rights, I think is an important aspect of the job and something that I'm prepared to do.
We had sort of a similar situation happen here in Chico with the shooting of Desmond Phillips, a young black man who's actually his father called to get support from police of his son having a mental health issue. And again, the amount of shots fired, really spells out to people an excessive use of force. I mean, 20 some, 14, I don't know how many shots were fired in that. And we have not been immune to bad policing. We've had an officer in Paradise who was, found guilty of shooting a suspect, and with video evidence of that. I guess I have a real layman's look at this, and I'm not a police officer. I very much respect the police. I deal with code enforcement sometimes in my job, and I don't have a weapon, and usually because of my de-escalation training and stuff, I can get people to comply without having to go to certain levels, just based on that training. When I see basically like the shooting range for police officers in that training, I mean, they basically have a torso area coming at them, and they're practicing on emptying a clip into that torso. I mean, shouldn't that be a full body graphic of a person, and shouldn't they be, if they are expert marksmen, shouldn't they be looking to preserve life? Because when I think about the job of a police officer, I think about protecting and serving. And when I think about the rule of law, I think about rights of innocent until proven guilty, and even protecting the life of someone that you're possibly taking into custody who has broken the law. So, I mean, are we getting that down to that minute level of how we're going to be doing policing in the future, and maybe taking out a knee or taking out a shoulder is better under the rule of law to preserve somebody being innocent until proven guilty?
Well, I think before you get to the point of the confrontation where you're shooting, you want to train the police and have policies in place that are designed to try to explore all other available means of de-escalating the situation to avoid the use of that kind of force. And so the objective of changing policies and retraining is to try to avoid getting to the circumstance where an officer is discharging his or her weapon. And so you could imagine, say, if someone is suspected of committing a misdemeanor and breaking into car windows or home windows, and you know where that individual is, rather than confronting him or her, cordoning off the area, letting the situation settle down a little bit, and then seeking the surrender of that individual voluntarily as opposed to confronting him. That's just one example. It is the case, though, that it's very difficult to hit a knee or hit an arm or do the sorts of things that you see in the movies in Hollywood. And so officers are trained to fire at center mass, because if someone does have a weapon and is threatening them or other people that the officer is trying to protect, other lives, other innocent lives that you're trying to protect, the goal is to stop that individual from committing that harm. So I think that it's very difficult to point to what should be shot at as a way of trying to minimize harm. Rather, I think you've got to start a lot earlier in looking at, the development of confrontations and what could be done to try to avoid the discharge of the weapon in the first instance. I think that's where the most productive energy ought to be directed. And I think, ideally is a place where we could get a lot of significant benefit by focusing on that area.